All right, ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Louis B. Free Radio Show, Brain Food from the Heartland. As promised, I am delighted to have as my guest the author of We See Each Other, A Black Trans Journey Through TV and Film. Tre'vell Anderson, welcome. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on with me. This wacky old aged flower child. So let's start with your background growing up a little bit. Tell us, if you would.
Yeah. So I am originally from Charleston, South Carolina. I grew up the child of a single parent. My mom was in the Army for 23 years. My grandmother was a pastor, so I grew up in the church, the Black church. And because she was in the military, we moved all over the place, right? So I've lived throughout the South, couple years in Germany as well. So, she's an international traveler now. And then, I went to school. I studied sociology in undergrad. I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Then I went to grad school, got my master's in journalism. And then I've been doing this journalism thing ever since, focusing on diversity in Hollywood, with the focus on Black and queer film. That's kind of the work that I've been doing in various different ways over the last year. And all of that has culminated now in this fabulous book that I have written. I think it's fabulous, at least, called We See Each Other, A Black Trans Journey Through TV and Film, as you mentioned. And I'm so excited to have it out in the world, finally.
Publication date today, correct?
Yes.
So how's that feel for you?
It's really weird, okay? Because, you do all of this work, you do all of this writing. Writing books is a very, lonely process, often, I feel like. Especially the way that I ended up doing my book. And so now that it's out in the world, people are reading it, it's just really, really interesting to have, I'm a journalist, so I'm used to writing, smaller pieces, more digestible pieces, but to have, 200 pages to just be able to kind of explicate as much as I want to is really, really interesting. So excited to have it out in the world. But it's still, I don't know, it's really weird. I feel like I should be walking around like, the fabulous new author, but I'm like, it's just another day, just another Tuesday.
Come on, it's not just another Tuesday. It's a publication day. I can't imagine what that would feel like to, having never written a book, but to turn over the final draft or whatever and say, know that it's out of your hands now. Mm-hmm. More corrections, no more, wait, I should have done this or that. And here it is, go.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because as journalists, you can make a correction if you got something wrong. You can, especially now with the internet, right? You can go and update the story and just fine. But once you close down the edit stage, I remember getting the first hard copy of the book to my house, and just being like, oh wow, it's real. It's real. And so it's been great. I'm so excited.
Wow, that's interesting. So journalism for you, tell us a little bit more about journalism. Why journalism?
That's a really great question, because the original plan when I went to school, I wanted to be Elle Woods in Legally Blonde. I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought I was gonna, go to Harvard and, I don't know what I thought I was going to do. But I ended up stumbling on journalism, ultimately in high school. I had an instructor, I was on the Model United Nations team in high school, and the advisor for the Model United Nations team was also the advisor over the media program at the high school. And she was like, you're a great writer, you should join the newspaper. So I did. And then when I finally went to college, I just kept working on the student newspaper, changed my major 12 times. And ultimately I decided, the most consistent thing in my life up to this point has been journalism and reporting and editorializing. And so I was like, you know what? Let's go to grad school. And that's when I decided to kind of commit my life to journalism, but doing it in my way, which, I think pushes up against some of the traditional things we might think of when we think of, what a journalist is supposed to be, how they are supposed to show up in particular spaces. I just kind of made a commitment to do this thing called journalism, but stay authentic to who I am and how I see the world.
Can you tell me a little bit about your way? So what was that like? Not doing
I tell people, I remember when my first kind of big person job was at the Los Angeles Times in a diversity fellowship program there. And I remember introducing myself to people in my bio as the love child of RuPaul, Wendy Williams, and Melissa Harris Perry, because I needed people to understand with these reference points what they were going to get, not only in my personality, but how I aim to write. And what we know is that so much in journalism, they teach us to be quote unquote objective. But I realized through the course of my work that, objectivity is just subjectivity from the perspective of the people who created it, who are already in power. So there is no such thing as objectivity, But as a journalist, I can be fair, I can be thorough, I can be well-researched, But I can't be objective. And so how can I go about doing this work while recognizing the biases that I have and not allowing them to negatively impact the story, but also not ignoring them, not to mention, when I show up to the interview, they are not expecting, me, especially when you think of a paper like the Los Angeles Times, for example. You're not expecting all of this wondrousness to, click clack through the door. Yes, they're not expecting that. And so I just remember always, sometimes you go into a particular space and you can see the mental calculation on somebody's face as they're assessing you.
Yeah.
I got used to seeing that a lot. Just because I was not and am not what folks expect when they think of a journalist. And so that's been an interesting journey.
That's fascinating, Tre'vell Anderson. I think for you, and that I love that self-examination. I like that's deep when you talked about how objectivity, et cetera, in journalism, and how you understood it from that perspective. And
well, I think part of that's the history, we have seen that various communities, when you go back and look at newspaper articles from back in the day, you can see the ways in which various communities just weren't covered appropriately. This is Black communities, these are queer and trans communities, these are indigenous communities, these are women communities. There's a very long history of the ways in which our news media has really perpetuated a lot of the violences, a lot of the negative experiences, a lot of I like to call them the isms and phobias of our lives: racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. And so for me, in my work, I want to make sure that I'm not perpetuating harm. And I think that requires us to think a little differently about how we do our storytelling.
You're fascinating, absolutely fascinating. The book, and it is Pub Day, so you can get the book everywhere. Please try to buy it as close to home as possible. The book, We See Each Other, a Black Trans Journey Through TV and Film. I'm delighted and honored to have the author as our guest, Tre'vell Anderson, Tre'vellAnderson.com. We've got all the links up, etc. Well, there's so much. I'd love to talk with you down the road more about journalism. I want to focus on the book, but just journalism today concerns local news being a tremendous concern with all the newspapers that have closed. And by the way, my studio that I'm in, can't see out there. It's in a building that housed a daily newspaper that shuttered a few years ago after publishing daily for 150 years. And you wonder, where are all the people that covered what are we not getting in journal? I mean, Down the road. I'm sure you've got some really good, interesting opinions and how people get the news today. Also,
it's changed so much, right?
Yeah.
It's such a big conversation. I'm also super active with the National Association of Black Journalists. I'm on their national board. So these conversations, right, these questions that you're bringing up about, you know, the decline of local news, about how people are getting their news these days, we're always like engaged in having those conversations. And I think really wanting to make sure that as we kind of uplift and talk about the major publications, we know that like the local outlets are really the ones documenting a community, and so many of them have gone away.
Yeah, and that concerns me, and some of the
Absolutely.
other cable news, etc. But we'll save that. Maybe someday, if you have time, we'll come back. I'd love to have that.
Absolutely.
The idea for the book. What was the, as they say, the tipping point? What was, you know, I'm thinking about this. I've got to do it.
Yeah, well, you know, the kind of core of the idea came about when I was working at the Los Angeles Times. My beat at the time was covering diversity in Hollywood with a focus on Black and queer film. And this was in a moment in which like the show Transparent was coming out for its second season. And I was interested in putting a timeline together of like, you know, these are the important moments of history of trans visibility on screen, and couldn't find one, right? Couldn't find a document or a place. And then I reached out to GLAAD, Nick Adams over at GLAAD, who is over, you know, their director of transgender representation. And he kind of provided me this like personal list that he had been keeping of the different trans characters that had been on screen since, you know, for as long as he could remember. And from there, I made that timeline. And then years later, I was like, what would it look like to have these films, these TV shows through my lens, through my perspective, collected together? And so I was like, I guess I'll write a book about it, because I couldn't find a text, right, that had this information. And, you know, that was the beginning of it. And I'll say that the idea for the book, you know, changed a couple of times throughout the journey of it. I sold it as like this comprehensive approach to the history of trans images on screen since the beginning of Moving Images. But the book that you got, it's a lot more personal. There's a lot of more elements of like memoir mixed in with the cultural critique and film criticism that happens in the book, as a means of, you know, kind of showing the impact, right, of the images that we see on screen, of the people that we see in our local communities. I really wanted to kind of honor and uplift some of those films, some of those shows. Maybe you've heard about them, maybe you haven't, and hopefully the book is like I've been calling it an amuse-bouche. Like I want the book to just whet people's appetite for trans history, for Black trans history, and hopefully you take it upon yourself to go search deeper and find more information about the ways that we have existed in this culture.
I'm talking with Tre'vell Anderson. Publication date for We See Each Other, a Black trans journey through and film. I've got to ask you, I'm sure you had I feel certain that you had a number of surprises when you were doing your research. Can you talk about a couple of them, or what was like,
yeah,
wow, or, you know, wow moments? What do you young people say? Wow moment. I don't know what the hip lingo is these days.
You know, well, so I'm a child of Oprah, so we call them aha moments, you know?
Why couldn't I think of, yeah, oh, that's my brain. Yeah,
that's all right. I think the things that stick out to me most, though, is that like in the process of doing the book, there is so much like existence and history that's already out there that folks just can't put a name to, right? Like we go through the world and so many people, for example, feel like they've never met a trans person, right? They feel like there's so much distance between them and, you know, the community. But when you look into the history of film and you say, and you find out that, for example, the character of Drinka Champagne in the Cheetah Girls movie, right, is played by a Black trans woman, you begin to realize that even in the early 2000s, when I was watching the Cheetah Girls and getting my life, right, there was a Black trans woman in this story, right? And it's important for us to say that and highlight those things. One, right, because we're going through a moment in culture in which certain folks want to make us believe that we as trans people are aberrations, that we dropped out of the sky in 2014 with Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black, as if we don't have this very long history that is documented in some ways and also not documented in others because of a specific targeted campaign, right, to erase us, to control us. And so part of doing the book was about reclaiming that history, right, about pointing our lenses on the folks who already existed in many of the movies or many of the shows that you've already seen. And the hope, right, is that once you begin to realize that actually trans people have always been here, we've always been your neighbors, we've always been your favorite, character on TV, we've always been, your favorite actor or actress perhaps, that will humanize our experiences, right? And that it will, in some ways, hopefully better, right, our lived experience, our lived reality, as we, continue gifting the culture so much.
When you say that, I'm sorry I get a little emotional. I don't understand what it is about people that have, this is a big topic, but what is it? Why do people feel the need to be a certain way? Why, why can't, why can't we all just get along? Why can't we all,
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
here's, no, I appreciate the vulnerability, right? Because we are living through in a moment of intense backlash and legislative attack on LGBTQ people, broadly speaking, on trans people, trans women and girls more specifically. And you're right, why can't we all just get along? But you know what? I think that we as trans people, we as non-binary people, we are freedom embodied. And I think that when some people see that freedom embodied, it unsettles so much lack of freedom within them, right? And so they want to control us.
Yeah.
They want to contain us when we're trying to say that there should not be containers, right? That we should be able to articulate and live and love as long as we're not harming anybody, however we want. Right? And I think so much about the world that's in conflict. I'll say it this way. That's in conflict with so much about our world that has taught us that folks have to be one way or the other,
and I hope you don't mind if I'm going to share a quick story that I've told before on the show. This was my early days in radio, at least 20 plus now, 20 plus years ago. And I was broadcasting up on Lake Erie, and something about gay marriage, and I can't remember all that, was a topic. And I remember I had a caller. He said, well, you're all for that gay marriage and da-da-da. The guy, was upset. He said, you're married, Louis, aren't you? I said, yes, sir, I am. How many years, whatever. He said, don't you realize how that affects your marriage? And I like to think about things. I don't like to be reactive. I like to be a little full. I don't want to, swear at him or shut down. Argument. I want to think how it affects my marriage. And I remember saying, you know what, sir, there's two people in the world that can affect my marriage, myself and my wife. Other loving people that he of course got upset with me, but I don't understand why that finger pointing and how it affects. How does two people that love each other getting married affect somebody else's marriage? I never understood that. I never understood
Yeah.
the need to lash out.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, and I'm sure somebody a lot smarter than me is, doing all the studies and whatnot now. But what I do know is
Maybe,
like,
maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe
maybe not, right?
that's the
But what
next
I
one.
do know is the reality of my lived experience, and I think you're so right, right? What does me living my life out loud, as long as I'm not harming anyone, how does that impact others, right? And I think that's a question that we all should ask ourselves. And I think that we should take that information and then we should do the right thing with it, right? Which is like, voting in that regard, right? Which is engaging in the legislative process in various ways, which, and it's one of those things where I always say that if you can't vote or act on behalf of what might be your best interests, do it in regards to what might be my best interest, right? As a Black trans person, as a Black non-binary person, because I promise you, all we are trying to do is just live our lives, right? To be happy, to be joy, and to show perhaps other people what it is like to be free, right? What it is like to love oneself, and what it is like to create oneself. And I think, that's one of the things in part with the book about it being, part history of trans images, but also part memoir. You get a little bit of my own personal story, my own personal, gender journey, in regards to what I was seeing or not seeing, as it were, on TV or in movies.
Difficult writing those parts, difficult looking, kind of, I don't know, I shouldn't say stepping back from yourself. I don't even know what that means, but being more introspective about those times.
Yeah, well, I think part of it, even in the nature, like I mentioned earlier, of the book switching from just being this like perhaps more clinical overview of trans history to it being something that's a lot more personal. I was watching Boys Don't Cry to write about it for the book. And if you have not seen Boys Don't Cry, it's based on the real life killing of Brandon Teena, who was a trans masculine person, a trans man who was violated over and over again. And Hilary Swank plays Brandon Teena in the movie. She, Oscar nominated, focus, a lot of awards attention on that film. But it's a deeply traumatic story. And oftentimes the history of trans people on screen is a traumatic one because those are the only narratives told about how we are existing and moving through the world. But there's so much more to us and our stories than the trauma. And so I was watching Boys Don't Cry and I said, why am I re-traumatizing myself? Why am I triggering myself watching these deeply traumatic movies in service of this clinical approach to a trans history? And that's when I decided to just like lean into the truth of my feelings, right? Which is not to say we don't talk about, some of those problematic portrayals. I definitely do. But I also wanted to focus on the joy and on, the community and the care that we also see.
Beautiful, beautiful. I wish we could spend hours together. Honestly, I'm loving the conversation. And again, the book, we've got all the links up. Book available everywhere online. You can also get IndieBound, etc. It's We See Each Other: A Black Trans Journey Through TV and Film. The author, my guest, Tre'vell Anderson. If you could take a minute and talk about your website.
Yes, Tre'vellAnderson.com. That's where you can go to find all of the fabulous, wondrous things that I am doing. It really is just an opportunity to just stay connected to what's happening with the book, We See Each Other. I also have a second book coming out later this year called Historically Black Phrases. I've been very busy the last year.
Boy, that opens. Go ahead.
Very, very busy. And that one's like a coffee table book, about Black language. And so Tre'vellAnderson.com, at Tre'vell Anderson on social media is how you can just, stay up to date. You can buy the book directly from that site if you're looking for places. But that's the place you can go.
And I've got to say, there's things about the social curation and media production house, Slayzhon. You've got lots. I've got to ask you, what do you do in your spare time? You've got another book. This book's the publication. You've got all this other stuff going on. Another book coming out this fall. What do you do? Do you have any spare time?
You know, I do my best to, you know, all the young folks, they call it self-care these days, you know, take a vacation here or go get a massage or something here. I love watching TV, so I watch like game shows. That's what I do in my free time. You know, shout out to the Game Show Network from back in the day. So, you know, I'm watching The Weakest Link. I'm watching Jeopardy. I'm watching, you know, Password, cooking shows. Love a cooking show.
Yeah.
That's what I do in my free time. When covering this work, when covering trans history, when covering the issues of trans community that we've been talking about, having a valve release, an energy release is deeply important, right? As a means of protecting ourselves and caring for ourselves. So I try to do that as much as possible. I could be better though. I'm not gonna lie. I do overwork.
Yeah. That's self-care. I hear that. You've got to love yourself. It's like I'm 70 years old. Come on, give me a break. The book, incredible. We See Each Other. Again, available everywhere online. A Black trans journey through TV and films. I went so far off my notes and questions, but I have loved the opportunity to have, and I want to be respectful to you and your team and the next host. So I hope we can do this again. Tre'vell Anderson, I've loved
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So much. How wonderful, ladies and gentlemen. How wonderful. And when you start to be